In this lecture, we will focus on the topic of environmentalism and anti-racist practice. The lecture will be structured around two main questions in relation to a host of core readings on the subject. The questions are, one, how are racism and the Anthropocene related? And two, what is the relationship between struggles for environmental justice and the struggle for decolonization? The core readings which we will review in order to bring these questions are Laura Pulido's 2018 chapter, Racism in the Anthropocene, Françoise Vergès' 2017 chapter, Racial Capitalocene, Is the Anthropocene Racial? Nancy Tuana's 2019 article, Climate Apartheid, The Forgetting of Race in the Anthropocene, Zoe Todd's 2015 essay, Indigenizing the Anthropocene, Linda Alvarez and Brenda Coulsett's 2020 article, Decolonizing Environmental Justice, A Latin American Perspective, Nick Estey's chapter, Liberation, from his 2019 book, Our History is the Future, Standing Rock versus Dakota Access Pipeline and the Long Tradition of Indigenous Resistance, and Nimno Bassi's 2018 chapter, The Climate Crisis and the Struggle for African Food Sovereignty. Racism and the Anthropocene. Laura Pulido begins her incisive 2018 chapter, Racism in the Anthropocene, by observing that although there have been heated debates on who, what, and where has caused the Anthropocene, there has been relative silence on the question of race. She admits that occasionally the matter of disparities in terms of causes and consequences of climate change does come up, but nevertheless insists that on such occasions, the emphasis tends to be on the chasm between rich and poor, or developed and developing countries, as if the geography of wealth and power was somehow non-racial. She further argues that though almost all leftists acknowledge the unevenness of the Anthropocene, regularly citing colonialism, racism, and gender as important factors contributing to differential vulnerability, they usually treat racism as ancillary to capitalism. In the chapter, Pulido seeks to counter such silence, indifference, evasion, or downgrading of the role of race in the Anthropocene. According to Pulido, not only does abundant research indicate that many environmental hazards follow along racial lines, but also many of the meta-processes that have contributed to the Anthropocene, such as industrialization, urbanization, and capitalism, are racialized. Consequently, she contends, the Anthropocene must be seen as a racial process. To make the case, Pulido seeks to highlight the evidence of racially uneven vulnerability and death, the form of racism at work, our general inability to acknowledge it, and the importance of history in coming to terms with the racial dimensions of the Anthropocene. In terms of racially uneven vulnerability and death, Pulido insists the evidence is legion. Moreover, she goes on to argue that such racially uneven geography of death from the Anthropocene should be understood as a contemporary form of primitive accumulation. Pulido contends that when we look at who will pay the greatest cost in terms of their lives, livelihoods, and well-being, it is overwhelmingly, to borrow a recently revived term from Vijay Prashad, the darker nations. While the differential vulnerability in terms of the haves and have-nots is acknowledged by many, she insists, the role of racism is generally overlooked. But the facts are clear. It is overwhelmingly places occupied primarily by non-white peoples that will pay the highest price for global warming, death. What's more, even within the wealthy parts of the world, the spatial distribution of risk, vulnerability, and death follows along pre-existing lines of racial inequality. Pulido emphasizes as well the indigenous dimension of this question. She contends, disproportionate vulnerability can also be seen in indigenous communities, which are increasingly being called frontline communities. Furthermore, she continues, scholars such as Kyle Powles-White have argued that indigenous people are already living in dystopia if one considers the ecological and social devastation of colonization and that global warming is a continuation of a centuries-long apocalypse. She argues, indigenous communities and their allies are engaged in intense battles across the Americas, from Canada to Peru. These communities not only wish to protect their lands, some of which are sacred, but also realize that continuing to extract and transport fossil fuels will place their communities and the entire planet in a more precarious position. We will come back to this indigenous dimension later, especially in relation to Nick Estey's work. But for now, let us focus on explicating Pulido's line of argument. She continues by noting that global leaders are well aware of the racial geography of the Anthropocene and have chosen not to act. To this end, she recounts events that occurred at the close of the United Nations Climate Summit in Copenhagen in December 2019, when governments agreed to a global temperature increase of 2 degrees Celsius. It was thought that 2 degrees would prevent global catastrophe. However, it was fully understood that 2 degrees would eliminate some island states and be absolutely disastrous for much of Africa. This is key, knowingly allowing large swaths of non-white, mostly poor people to die. She therefore poses the question, given that our global leaders have condemned millions of people to death, we have to ask, why? How are we able to make such a decision? The answer, according to Pulido, is a particular form of widespread contemporary racism, indifference. Indeed, she insists, it is indifference that characterizes the attitudes, practices, and policy positions of much of the global North toward those destined to die. Such indifference, she insists, qualifies as a form of racism. In this respect, she follows the definition of racism famously advanced by Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who argues that racism is best conceived as exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerabilities to premature death in distinct yet densely interconnected political geographies. Given such a definition, Pulido contends, while more than indifference was needed to create the conditions that produce such racially differentiated vulnerability, it is maintained by indifference. One of the main challenges to seeing race in the Anthropocene, Pulido maintains, is the excessively narrow definition of racism espoused by many. Pulido writes, in much of the world, conceptions of racism have been constricted in order to minimize its perceived impact. Particularly insidious in this regard is the role of state-promoted anti-racisms, whose power, Pulido contends, following Jody Melamed, lies in their ability to convince the general population that meaningful racial progress is being made while simultaneously masking the violence of the contemporary racial order, which is precisely what is happening in the Anthropocene. Alongside this problem of racial denialism, there is the problem of ahistoricism. According to Pulido, those who wish to avoid grappling with the legacies of previous racial formations, especially those based on more overt forms of white supremacy and violence, are deeply invested in ahistoricism. However, one silver lining of the Anthropocene discourse, which Pulido contends is less a geological epic than it is a story, is that it forces us to reckon with history. Pulido focuses in on a date proposed by Lewis and Maslin to mark the beginning of the Anthropocene, the year 1610. This is the year that witnessed both transcontinental range expansion among food species and a decline in carbon emissions. The latter of these was due to massive death in the Americas. And though they never mention it, Pulido adds, racism is a crucial feature of the events of 1610. Even if contemporary indigenous studies scholars such as Jody Bird have pointed out that there are important distinctions between colonization and racism, Pulido nevertheless insists there is no escaping the fact that racism informs colonization. The sense of entitlement entailed in the appropriation and the theft of the land ultimately rests on a deep sense of superiority. Here Pulido makes recourse to the conceptual apparatus of racial capitalism. Pulido follows Lisa Lowe in this regard, according to whom the term racial capitalism captures the sense that actually existing capitalism exploits through culturally and socially constructed differences such as race, gender, region, and nationality, and is lived through those uneven formations. It refutes the idea of a pure capitalism external to or extrinsic from the racial formation of collectivities and populations. Alongside and at the birth of racial capitalism, Pulido also invokes the concept of primitive accumulation. Racism, she insists, informs contemporary capitalism and its antecedents, including primitive accumulation. Here she quotes Marx himself, towards the very end of the first volume of Capital, where he argues that the discovery of gold and silver in the Americas, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of blackskins, signalized the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. Capitalism emerged, continues Marx, dripping from head to foot, from every pore, with blood and dirt. According to Pulido, primitive accumulation was essential to creating the initial surplus that subsequently allowed for the development of industrial capitalism. And crucially, proto-capitalists, colonists, and Christians all drew on white supremacy as they went about the business of severing indigenous peoples from their land and labor. The legacy of such primitive accumulation continues to this day. Pulido reminds us that not only did Eric Williams document how Caribbean slavery helped finance England's early industrial and financial development, so too have recent books by Edward Baptiste and Walter Johnson also demonstrated how the profits of slavery contributed to contemporary US capitalism. This is hardly the ancient past, Pulido insists. To the contrary, these are the relations that birthed the modern world and which continue to shape it. Moreover, she continues, while primitive accumulation helps explain the role of the past in producing the racial map of the Anthropocene, it is relevant for another reason. While many relegate primitive accumulation to the annals of history, the truth is that it is back with a vengeance. Nor should it be forgotten, she contends, that both old and new forms of primitive accumulation require enabling ideologies. And though there have been important changes, racism, especially indifference, remains an important one. Which brings her to conclude, in relation to the Paris Accord, that we cannot overlook the anemic nature of the agreement considering the magnitude of the problem, that it will not avoid the death of millions, because they simply do not matter. Racial Capitalocene. Françoise Vergès, in her chapter, Racial Capitalocene, is the Anthropocene racial, included in a recent edited volume on futures of Black radicalism, published by Verso, helps further clarify the connection between racial domination and the domination of humans over nature. To this end, Vergès quotes the historian Joachim Radkau, who has written that the chief problem of colonialism seems to have been not so much its immediate ecological consequences as its long-term impact, the full extent of which became apparent only centuries later, in the era of modern technology, and many times only after the colonial states had acquired their independence. Vergès goes on to argue in favor of an alternative terminology to that of the Anthropocene, to refer to the current geological epoch in which the climate catastrophe is unfolding, namely the racial capitalocene, in a play off Cedric Robinson's concept of racial capitalism. Vergès adds that the elaboration of a narrative of the racial capitalocene requires precisely the integration of this long memory of colonialism's impact and the fact that destruction in the colonial era becomes visible in the post-colonial era. This means supplementing the often presentist discourse of environmental racism with a deeper historical consciousness and story about origins. Such a story, Vergès contends, must also include an analysis of capitalism, imperialism, gender, class, and race, and a conception of nature and of being human that opposes the Western approach. In such a vein, she points to the 1991 Principles of Environmental Justice, the first principle of which declared that environmental justice affirms the sacredness of Mother Earth, ecological unity, and the interdependence of all species, and the right to be free from ecological destruction. According to Vergès, such a principle posits a new understanding of what it is to be human and challenges the international dialogue on climate change that focused on a strategy of adaptation. Adaptation through technology or the development of green capitalism has indeed been presented as a good strategy, yet, Vergès contends, it does not thoroughly address the long history and memory of environmental destruction about which Radkau has written, nor the asymmetry of power. Vergès' story of origins, it turns out, draws explicitly on Jason Moore's world ecological paradigm and account. In Vergès' articulation, in the reconfiguration of the world that followed the colonization of the Americas and the Caribbean, nature was transformed into a cheap resource as endlessly renewable as the bonded workforce. Moreover, against a certain discourse of the Anthropocene, she adds, it is human praxis as labor and the global use of a color line in the division of labor that must be studied, and not a human death drive. She furthermore continues by referencing Moore in arguing, to unpack the different levels of racialized environment, we need to go back to the long 16th century, the era of Western discoveries of the first colonial empires, of genocides, of the slave trade and slavery. The modern world mobilized the work of commodified human beings and uncommodified extra-human nature in order to advance labor productivity within commodity production. She insists, racialized chattel were the capital that made capitalism. Africa was forced to share its social product, human beings, with the Atlantic slave trade. But the slave trade consisted of not only the organized deportation of millions of Africans to continents and islands, but also a massive transfer of plants, animals, diseases, soil, techniques, and manufactured goods from Europe. She concludes, capitalism relied for growth on an endless access to nature as excess, as a bounty of extra-human biological systems and geological distributions, plants, silver, gold, iron, core. Towards the end of her chapter, Vergès broaches the radical emancipatory suggestion that world citizenship and humanism must be brought in as decolonizing alternatives. She concludes with an evocative quote by Fanon, who wrote in 1961 that each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it, to which she adds, "We are at a critical juncture, a historical moment that sends us into our inheritances to find resources and references for the struggle ahead. The story of origins, then, is for Vergès, but a crucial grounding for a future-oriented fight for freedom, for an end to racial oppression, and for planetary survival." And with that, we shall take a break.